What's up, everybody? Well, I have an opportunity to make a video wherein I don't have to whisper this time. And if you're wondering what that noise was, in my last video it was me moving something around, just me scooting something from point A to point B. And I want to say that finally my Ohio package came in. Very pleased. Very, very pleased. What happened was I had been given an offer on these dolls because I had looked at them one time. One of the cheapest Kidcore dolls ever listed. And she was listed with one of the original Chelsea dolls from around 2010 to 12. And what's interesting about the original Chelsea dolls is that they used to have removable clothing. And of course there were no boys until Darren in 2013. He was kind of a prototype. And then they made the more modernized, I think he's called Otto with the plastic hair, in 2016. And so before they introduced the boys, they used to have removable clothing and just panties that said Chelsea. And oddly enough, right around the time, I think I might have written a suggestion that they should have a male Chelsea doll. When they started introducing the boys, was right around the time, I think not long after Darren was introduced, they started having girls with non-removable clothing. And that meant that, she was in like a bathing suit. That was also the bodice of a dress. And she would have only a skirt that was removable and shoes. And I've talked about why they probably went to that right around the time of the boys being made, and they did have removable clothing. See, they had briefs, more simplistic briefs that didn't say Chelsea. And so the boys could be stripped naked. You could remove their onesie outfit like a all-in-one short set. Whereas the girls, had dresses that were part of their body with only a removable skirt. Well, before that, they used to have removable clothes, and this one has pigtails. And I had a couple of them like this, but I have always suspected that the reason they started doing it like that, conveniently, right around the time boys were introduced, was so that you couldn't take a dress off of a girl and put it on the boy, to try to preclude stupidity like putting a boy in a dress, as I've talked about before. The Tommy dolls were made androgynous or unisex enough. And of course the name Tommy being unisex to begin with, whether Rugrat fans like it or not. Tommy is a unisex name. Just like Billy and Bobby, with an IE. Well, anything, you change the Y to an IE and it's a girl's name. Tommy dolls were unisex enough, and also, the original Darren, which was just like a Tommy, and the Julian that briefly existed in the Sew in Style line, they're unisex looking enough, that they could, if you put them in a dress, you could just say, oh, well, that's a little girl now, doesn't matter, just a little girl with a shorter haircut. But once the skin fade started being popular and cute and perfected, and they made Darrens that were clearly a boy. They wanted to get rid of the dresses, so that they put the girl's outfit as the bodice of a dress with a skirt. So that while you could put a skirt on a boy, he would be shirtless and just look like a Tarzan or a, Donnie Thornberry type character. To sort of preserve the masculinity of the boys and the privacy of the girls, I think, that's why it was done that way, because everything is done for a reason. And they wanted shirtlessness, in addition to short hair, to be associated with boys. And so a lot of these things are, why we can't have more boy dolls, because people do stupid things with them, wanting to make cross-dressers and nudists out of them. And so yeah, this Kidcore doll, she was defective, which is why she was on clearance. Not sure what to do with her. But they came with a little proportionally 18-inch doll. I say 18-inch because she's about 3 inches, and that's 18-inch. So they have a dolly of their own. They're dolls with a doll. So this one is in between. See, she's a little bit shorter than Kate. So I have to put them some clothes on when their hair dries a little bit more. There's my Ohio dolls. My Ohio dolls. Finally. And as soon as I made that song, it was scanned in Dallas, of all things. So it was almost like the country song was a magic spell that caused it. Because what really happened, I mean, the logical explanation is it was on the way. Because what's really happening with these packages is that when they go across state lines, a lot of times they don't get intermittent scans, because, they might it looks like they're spending 5 days, or not 5 days, maybe like 3 days or something in Ohio, Columbus, Ohio. But what's really happening is they're just scanned there, and then they go on a long road trip. And until they stop and are sorted and found and scanned at a closer state, it's like you may not get little scans at every point, you know what I'm saying? And the other thing I found is that if I don't check it often, I will not be notified. It might be scanned in Dallas, but I'm not immediately notified of that till maybe several hours later. So there's my new Chelsea doll that already had one like her. And then there's a Kidcore doll with a messed up face where she rubbed on something. So I don't know. Anything I put them in will be better than nudity, is how I feel. Don't think I'm going to make boys out of them, but, just put them in clothes. I have plenty of clothes. See, I have the clothes and other people have the nude dolls. So, just want to talk about that, how my Ohio dolls came in. So I can quit bashing Ohio and Columbus and all that. But I just wanted to use this time to talk about how it just angers me so much. The ideas that people have about things, because my life experience, as I've stated before, just doesn't, in so many cases, it just doesn't affirm that. I mean, so much about my life isn't normal. I feel like I used to think, the thumb sucking was, pretty much the only thing abnormal about me. But what I learned was that while that may have been the case in early childhood, that may have been the case when I was little, that, the most eccentric thing about me was that I sucked my thumb, and most kids stopped by age 3, And my sister happened to suck a pacifier. And by the time she was 3 years old, my mom basically weaned her off of it by pretending, she conveniently left the pacifier at my grandma's house, and she refused to buy her another one. I think she was exactly 3 years old, almost to the day. And, so many kids just didn't suck their thumb, because most kids are given a pacifier ASAP. And, that's a lot easier to break, if they have to have a pacifier, because it's more embarrassing, It isn't part of your body. It has to be sterilized. And, it's easier to give up. It's easier to just get rid of the pacifier at a young age, and they cry and cry and cry, but, it's like ripping the Band-Aid off early. But then if they suck their thumb, it's like, what do? Chop off a part of their body? It's harder to break that habit, because it's like you'll always have your thumb, unless, God forbid, something horrible happens. But, I used to think that was the most eccentric thing about me, and, the only thing that really separated me from the norm. But what I unfortunately found was that as time went on, that became increasingly untrue. It's the funniest thing. It's like once you're like you start out, like I just stated before, I did not look forward to being a teenager because I was already weird as a kid. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I was already immature for my age as a kid. But the fact that I was a kid, per se, meant that to an extent people just overlooked it and pretended it was okay. Because, she's just a kid. But 7th grade was uniquely bad. A uniquely bad time in my life. You know, as I've stated before, other grades were not wonderful. The 7th grade was extremely awkward and different because it was a crossroads. It's like you had both. It's like you had the worst of both worlds. At the beginning of the school year, I had most of my classmates still in childhood, what I consider childhood or middle childhood. I mean, really and truly, early childhood should end on the 6th birthday, and middle childhood should end on the 12th birthday. Adulthood should begin on the 18th birthday, so that you're chopping childhood in thirds. So, young children are under age 6. Older children would be 6 through 11 and 3/4. Adolescents would be 12 through 17 and 11 months. So, early, middle, and late childhood, which is adolescence. So, most of puberty would happen in adolescence, 12 through 17 and a half. So, 7th grade was especially bad or awkward because at the beginning of the school year, it's like you have a majority of your classmates that still are not teenagers yet. And as such, not many of the boys have gone through the voice change. And you don't really know whether or not the girls have a period, because it's really none of your business with girls. With boys, I mean, they can't hide whether or not they're almost finished with puberty. Pretty freaking obvious. Even if they don't open their mouth, they have other signs of looking more masculine. And so 7th grade, at the beginning of the year, most of the kids, very childlike, very elementary. But by the end of the year, while they haven't suddenly turned into adults overnight, they are entering their teens and becoming more adolescent, at least in behavior, if not physically. By 8th grade, it's almost half of the boys have gone through the voice change by graduation. Then high school is pretty much exclusively everyone has at least reached puberty and more likely finished it. Pretty much all the girls and all but a few boys are mostly through with puberty in high school. So high school is a place of adolescence and adult-like teens, okay? Elementary school was pretty much a place of kids who, although maybe in early puberty, were still more or less kids. So you knew what to expect. It was very predictable, very childlike in elementary, and very adolescent and more adult-like in high school. Well, 7th grade was the middle of middle school, smack dab in the middle, wherein it was very unpredictable, very emotional, very awkward, very confusing, because you really didn't know. In some ways, the kids were kids. In other ways, they were like adolescents or adults. And in my case, I was more adult-like because I had been redshirted and I was female and somewhat of an early bloomer, though not by much. So, very awkward year, awful, depressing year. And it just angers me so much, when people say other people's life experiences do not align with my own in many ways. First there's the thumb sucking. Most people think that you stop sucking any such thing by about 3 years old. So even a Rugrats episode talking all about it, which, made me hate Angelica even more than I ever did. It's called Thumbs Up, about thumb sucking being bad, even for babies. And So, there was that eccentricity, but then there's also this misconception, as I've stated before. I've talked a lot with chatbots about this, about how people have this misconception that when a kid turns 18, they go away to college. It's like a whole new world. They drink, they party, they don't really care about themselves. They don't take care of themselves. And ironically, they start getting more colds, not like in kindergarten, but more than they had in high school, which that does not align with my experience. You know what I'm saying? Because in my case, I had a much more gradual decline in colds. Like I didn't have periods of childhood where I was never sick. Childhood meaning under 18. In this case, I didn't have periods of my adolescent life where I just never got a cold, not counting summers when you shouldn't anyway. I was just steadily exposed to young children, especially my little sister and occasionally my cousins and her friends and my sister's friends and all that. So it's like I consistently, had a very gradual reduction in colds. Maybe some years were worse than the previous one, but not by much, Did not have any years with less than 4 colds until my senior year, but don't think I ever had a number that wouldn't be within the normal range. Like, I think a dozen could be considered normal in a kindergarten child. And in 8th grade, since the 9 colds I had were relatively mild, never needed antibiotics or anything, because they were not severe colds and they were all coming from my sister in her kindergarten germs, they were still considered normal because it's like the surrounding years were not like that. 7th grade I only had 4, 9th grade I had 5, 10th grade 4 plus chicken pox, so it was kind of, not really an average of being that high. So like I was getting maybe, like an average of between 6 and 7 colds. There's that 6, 7 again. When I was kindergarten through 8th grade, not sure about exact numbers below for sure the 5th grade. I know I had at least 4. No year was as good as, or no year was better than 7th grade, put it that way. So if I only had 4 in 7th grade, I don't think I had any better years before that. So then I got into high school and it was like 4 or 5 on average, because if you have 18 colds in 4 years, that's between 4 and 5. Then college, it went down a little bit, as I've stated before, and I've shown the graphs before a million times. College was like the national average for a little while, 2 to 3. I would typically get 1 in a typical fall semester and 2 in a typical spring semester since it began in winter. So 2 to 3 colds started out, it was like 18 to 23. But then after 24, it just plateaued at around a little less than 1 per year. So I didn't really have any peaks. It was just a gradual bumpity bump downward. From kindergarten through the present day, it just dropped and then plateaued a little less than 1 per year. And other people, supposedly report very strange experiences with colds in comparison to mine. Like some people say that they went 5 years in their teens without a freaking cold. I mean, that's hard to believe, especially for a male. It's like, I find it hard to believe because I don't recall anyone at my school that I would think went more than 1 year without a cold. Pretty much everyone seemed to have at least one at some point during the school year. And so, people will say like that they were hardly ever getting colds in high school. And I'm thinking, what's the deal with that? Why would you go 5 years as a teenager without getting colds and then suddenly start getting them in college? Well, for one thing, I didn't go away to college, because my college days were kind of an extension of childhood, wherein I had a little bit of freedom that ended up being too much. I did bad things with what little freedom I had. But by and large, I went to a junior college, and it was like high school 2.0. Or, my young adult years were like adolescence 2.0 or something like that. It wasn't really that much different. Yeah, I was growing older, but not really growing up, so to speak. you know, I just saw a continued decline in colds gradually, but I still had them, you know what I'm saying? And they were still coming from a little sister, you know, not from my own college experience. You know, I didn't have a bunch of friends in college that were exposing me to these germs. They were still from my little sister. And because she was getting older, you know, she was sort of dropping down to a more adult level, like 2 to 3 colds in high school. Um, you know, it was like she had a decline, perhaps at a little earlier age because she didn't have a younger sibling, you know, bringing her colds, you know, in her teens, but she was still getting them in high school. And I would, from 24 onward, I would still tend to get about one from her per year, and she might have 2 to 3. Um, so yeah, I mean, my experience with colds is somewhat different than most, but it's still considered, like, it's not considered problematic. You know what I'm saying? Because if you're below average, then that's not problematic. You know, that's a good thing. You know, if the average is supposed to be 2 to 4 colds, which I find ridiculous, and your average is 1 or less, well, that's considered good. And the fact that I haven't ever needed antibiotics to get over one since I was 9, you know, with a baby sister, and I was in the 3rd grade. I don't know that I've ever had an ear infection since I was maybe 6. I think age 6 might have been the only year I had ear infections. And bronchitis, I haven't had that since I was 9. Tonsillitis. I had one isolated case at 16, but I don't think I happen to have a cold. It's just out of the blue. You know, but I mean, all these illnesses kind of, they mostly, you know, cleared up on their own, without much or any medical intervention. Like I didn't really need anything for COVID. I just went because I had to be tested. But yeah, it's like because these illnesses were self-limiting, short-lived, they're not considered problematic. But I'm still not the norm. And I'll go ahead and post this video. Like I said, any outfit I put on them is better than the nudity they had going before. Anything is better than nudity.